Now, to finish off the morning session, I would like to invite David Robertson, who is the director of the Four Aces Trust, which of course owns the Cottier Theatre, and he is also a trustee of this building. So two important church buildings in Glasgow which are being put to new uses and being very lovingly and painstakingly restored. No small achievement. We're going to hear today specifically about the South Transept window in the Websters Theatre. So please welcome David Robertson.
This window is unfortunately not able to be seen. It lives above us to your right, and that is where it will hopefully return in the not too distant future. It's thought, and I think Gordon has very eloquently described it, as Alf Webster's masterwork, his most glorious window. And I just want to spend a little while analysing things about it. I have some background in art history, and I think the problem with art history is that you do analyse things rather than just looking at them. And I would like to just preface what I'm saying by making the point that you can't really enjoy this window without looking at it, but it's still, there's many interesting things to be said about it. Just in terms of the theme of the window, it seems obvious that it's the Easter week, and it has various scenes from the New Testament. Starting on your far right, the bottom is Christ entering Jerusalem on Palm Sunday with the palms. Skipping the middle bottom one to the left, it's the part of the window I'm going to concentrate on the most. It's been referred to as St. Paul preaching, but I would put a serious question mark over that being St. Paul. I think it's Christ preaching, and I'll explain a bit more about that in due course. Above that window is the Garden of Gethsemane, the Passion with Christ receiving the blood and being looked down upon by various figures, mysterious figures. Then the crucifixion, and then the resurrection, and then back to the first bottom right corner, which I think is also the New Jerusalem, with Christ entering in a more ghostly form. If I could have the next slide. This is why the window had to be taken down, and these are shots. It was taken down in 2008, funded by the Pilgrim Trust. A big scaffold had to be put up, and Canon McInnes had the very nerve-wracking business of taking the window down and putting it into storage in this building where it still is. And an example of the upper lancet, not that one, but the one across from that, can be seen upstairs in the hall just now. Linda Cannon came down last night, and we've got it on a light box. And that's actually the best thing you can do in relation to this window, is to go and look at the artist's work firsthand. If I could have the next slide, please. The window splits because it's such a long vertical transept, as is this building, so tall and vertical. You've really got what could be 3 lancet windows at the top and 3 lancet windows at the bottom, and they're very cleverly joined together, these 6 scenes, by this all sorts of compositional devices, because Alf Webster's, among so many things, a master of composition within a 2-dimensional stained glass window. And these twisting vines and other elements serve to tie everything together. So the top window has the events which are more watched over by the heavenly figures, angels, and involve Christ in his particular journey, whereas the lower ones are more to do with the people. If we could have the next slide, please. And the sinners against the skyline of London, the penitents here being given communion by an angel, and then the ordinary folk in the New Jerusalem where Christ is. In between, you've got elements which involve this angelic figure here with the sword. You've got Lansdowne Church joining these two, the crucifixion and the penitence, and you've got the city chambers with the dove holding on to it. And these are the central bits that hold the two halves of each window together. Could I have the next slide, please? when I first saw the window about 10 years ago and saw that particular angelic figure, I immediately thought of William Blake, just because you do if you're familiar with William Blake's work, and there's an example of it down there. And looking at it more closely, there's 3 pictures of William Blake. I could almost believe it was a portrait of Blake. Certainly the nose is very similar. What this figure is doing is holding a sword in one hand and a scales in the other hand. And he's obviously a figure involved in judging the sinners below. And he's also a frightening figure, I would say. Next slide, please. The thought that Blake has influenced Webster crops up in other ways. This is a figure from Blake on the right, and this is this a statuette being held by one of the penitents receiving the communion, which has that same hunched appearance, which reminds me of the Blake figure. The next. And there's an Nebuchadnezzar Blake there with his beard and these starry eyes. And again, I find a similarity in the illustrative qualities of some of these bearded figures with their whitish eyes and rather haunted feeling, this whole Gothic feeling about the window. It's not, as someone said, not a sort of happy pre-Raphaelite window. It's got all sorts of more menacing dimensions to it, more apocalyptic kind of feeling to it. Next slide, please. And so looking at Blake and some of the themes of Blake and whether Blake is influencing Webster and whether Webster is exploring Blake's work in this window. This is the vision of St. Michael by Blake with the crucifixion and the serpent, which is a big feature of Blake's work, coiled around the crucifixion there. Next slide, please. So looking at the context of why Webster might find Blake as a source, Webster was at the School of Art much the same time as the Belgian symbolist Jean Delville was there, as he was brought in by Newbery as a teacher of the first rank really from Europe, and set up the painting department, or came into the painting department. And Blake's obviously the sort of the progenitor of symbolism, and would have been an influence, it's very probable, on the Belgian symbolists and other French symbolists. And I think you can see something in these 2 slides with the Delville painting to the right and the Blake illustration to the left. Next slide, please. And I think that follows through possibly into Webster's use of the same kind of hanging in space form with the wings that Karen illustrated. These are Larbert Church musician angels, and translated into a stained glass type of work. Next, please. Other aspects that might suggest that he's influenced by Blake is the strong connection we know exists, and I've been reading Peter Cormac's recent book and coming to this thought that Christopher Wall, the most influential of the art and craft stained glass artists of the early 20th century, he has a window here of the heavenly city of Jerusalem where he selected some of his favorite buildings, the Duomo in Florence and Gothic cathedrals, and placed them in the window to form the heavenly city. And sometimes you get windows within windows for buildings within windows, which you can look through. And Webster's obviously made taken a similar idea in his skyline of London and his skyline of Glasgow. His skyline of London isn't the heavenly city, but skyline of Glasgow appears to be. And London has St. Paul's Cathedral as the most dominant feature in the top there on the Thames. The next slide, please. Looking again at the people around Christopher Wall who are collaborating with him or were his pupils. On this side, you've got Lewis Davis, a detail from the window in Dunblane Cathedral. These fantastic windows actually portrays Blake holding Jerusalem in his hand, making his way upwards to heaven. And on this side, Caroline Townsend, in 1907, actually a William Blake window with some text from Milton, Jerusalem there. And so I'm thinking that given the relationship between Webster's treatment of stained glass and the fact that these are his contemporaries, and he's moving Stephen Adams' studio from that more aesthetic movement style to this more arts and crafts style, there's every possibility that he was aware of the interest that these artists were taking in William Blake, which extended, according to Peter Cormack, to actual techniques for the engraving to stained glass that they used and thought about. Next slide, please. So what was Blake about? Well, that's a tall order to go into, but it's interesting that in 1903, just before these artists are featuring Blake, this actual published book of Blake's Jerusalem, the Emanation of the Giant Albion, was published in ordinary type rather than Blake's illustrative handwriting. And so there was available, that's Blake's last really big work. It's available in ordinary type from 1903. Blake had been really brought more into prominence by the pre-Raphaelites, by Rossetti and Swinburne, and so he was already a bit of a hero, but now he's published in 1903 in ordinary type. And I think it's interesting to think about Webster's window in the context of some of these statements that Blake, this is the introduction to that book written by the publisher, Russell and McLagan. Man is at once a stage and protagonist in a drama with which Blake is concerned. The fourfold man called symbolically by the name Albion. I'm just jumping through some of these. I won't read the whole thing. Blake's concern with the parting of reason and imagination as a great tragedy in the human psychology. Humanity is overcome by a deadly sleep as a result, full of dreams in which man wavers between good and evil, a sleep from which only Christ, the divine imagination, can save the fallen man by reuniting him with Jerusalem, his emanation, and saving him from the dominion of his spectre, the great selfhood called Satan. I just think that adds quite a lot of drama to the window if you look at the window through those kind of Blakean eyes. If we can have the next text. Blake's Satan, again with these outstretched hands, which is reminiscent of that figure in Webster's window, exulting over Eve. In Blake's picture, Satan's evil nature may be seen to be distilled in the form of a snake, which you see wrapped around Eve there. But he's not treated as a figure by Milton, as he's treated quite differently than the sort of Satan which in our popular mind we think of. Next slide. So returning to the question of Webster's figure, is this meant to be Satan? It's got a cross over his head, but we're on this complicated area here where Satan's role. But Blake isn't someone who you can just take literally. He obviously moves concepts through his personal iconography in a specific kind of way. But my thought in looking at this window is that you've got this Blake-like figure, which could be Satan, hanging over St. Paul's. And this question about that, why is he portrayed London as an evil place and Glasgow as a heavenly place? Is it just because he's anti-English or something? I don't believe that is the case. I think it's to do with Blake and Blake's poems. If we could move to the next slide. This is really to illustrate what I just said. To Blake, London was an image Blake used all the time as to describe the condition of humanity as he saw it. Humanity in the throes of experience, struggling to be set free from forces which limited its development. And that was represented by Blake, who spent most of his life in London under the shadow of St. Paul's, to be the case. Whereas Jerusalem, whose name means peace, was mankind under the guardian of better angels. And that's a very central theme to all Blake's work. Next slide, please. This is, Blake has a poem in the Songs of Experience called London. And when you read some of these lines, they're familiar because you just pick them up subliminally. And I think that if we look at some details from Webster's London picture, could have those. These are quotes from Blake, which I think compare with the image of Christ. I believe it is Christ. He's the nimbus. Why would he be St. Paul in Easter week? You know, it doesn't make any sense. I think that's come because of St. Paul's on the skyline, that someone has made that connection, unless there's more specific evidence. So I think that's Christ preaching to the people in the city of London, which is Blake's London. And these are some quotes I wander through each charted street near where the charted Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. Until the high dome of St. Paul's, they like Thames waters flow, which is reference to Blake's critique of the way that the poor children are given on the Holy Thursday. They're let into St. Paul's in uniforms, but they're completely ignored the rest of the year, and because he was a terrific social commentator. Look up, O citizens of London, enlarge thy countenance. The whore, the gambler by the state licensed, build that nation's fate. And we certainly have those two figures here with the playing cards between them in Webster's window. So I'm suggesting that this London is Blake's London rather than Webster's dislike of Londoners. Next slide. And I mentioned a serpent and as a theme in Blake. And here with the resurrection in Webster's window, you see the text that he has destroyed with his great strong sword, the swift serpent. And in the corner there with the sword with the crucifixion on it, you see him destroying the serpent, which is Satan's spectre. And that is the Jerusalem window. And it's obviously meant to be the New Jerusalem because that Christ is entering into. It has a quote from Ezekiel right in the corner there. The name of that city from that day shall be the Lord is there. And that is about the future heavenly city. So just that now you're looking at the window perhaps with slightly fresh eyes. It's only one particular exploration. I think the window deserves, as someone said, serious scholarly study in the future. But the one I haven't really talked about is the middle lower one, which has Lansdowne Church glowing away and the penitents with receiving the communion. Next slide, please. And I, in doing a bit of research for this, came across this text from Blake, which isn't meant to refer to Webster, but I thought was topical and interesting. From the text of Jerusalem, the emanation of the giant Albion. What is a church and what is a theatre? Are the two not one? Can they exist separately? Are not religion and politics the same thing? Brotherhood is religion, or demonstrations of reason, dividing families in cruelty and pride. A theme of Blake, obviously I'm commenting on that because it's relevant to this building, but the theme of Blake is how reason, which he seems to associate more with Satan, when out of balance with imagination and emotion, it creates divisions in people's minds, which leads them into conflict. And really, if people just looked at things the way they were, they wouldn't get so uptight about some of these things. Okay. 2 more slides, and that will be time for lunch. Obviously, we'd love to get this window back in its position and raise the money to do that. And create access to the window so that people can come and visit it up there, even when people are maybe rehearsing and doing work in here in this temporary environment, because it is intended that this is temporary and we restore the whole interior. But it would be much nicer if we could get this window done before that happens. And a little picture of Alf coming through a new doorway there, which I'd like to see us slapping in that stone wall, which enable people to come up in the lift just behind the bar and walk through where we have a gap between the roofs of the buildings and build a little visitor facility there. And my last slide is this one, which gives you a view just from a sort of bird's eye view looking into a cutaway of the building. If we could have an archive room, and Robin Webster suggested there's material that could be possible to go in there, a passageway to the window, and a display in a very atmospheric steeple space, which has a huge ladder going up this slender steeple of what it might feel like to be in a stained glass artist's workshop, and then the window reinstated. So as a little project, we could do that. And I don't know, Bayula is here, but if anyone thinks that they might want to put their hands in their pockets, this is the person to speak to when you're having lunch, and she'll direct you to the box office counter. I hope someone will come in and discuss anything like that with you. Okay, thanks very much.